Okay, guys. Hi, my name is Adam Rocha. I'm the founder of the San Antonio Film Festival, and I'm here today. I'm so grateful to be here with author Glenn Frankel, who's for many years worked with the Washington Post, winning a Pulitzer-Prize in 1989. He's taught journalism at Stanford University and the University of Texas at Austin, where he's directed the School of Journalism. He's won the National Jewish Book Award and was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and is a Motion Picture Academy film scholar. He's a best-selling author of The Searchers and High Noon and lives in Arlington, Virginia. So I'm excited to introduce him, and the book he's going to talk about is The Making of Midnight Cowboy and the I just messed up the title. Go ahead. It's floor is yours, sir.
Don't worry about it. It's called Shooting Midnight Cowboy, and it's got an endlessly long subtitle, which is, let's see if I can get it, Art, Sex, Loneliness, Liberation, and the Making of a Dark Classic. Because it tries to take in not only the making of this really iconic American movie, which was filmed in '68 and came out in '69, which, as some people may remember, was a pretty turbulent, anxious, crazy time in American society and in American culture. The book's not only about the making of the movie, but like all of my movie books, it's really about what the movie tells us about that era. I think movies are a great looking glass into the past. And by the same token, when you learn about the era, that's a great looking glass into the movie itself. So I've been doing this kind of curious, hybrid book for 3 times now. I did it with John Ford's classic Western, The Searchers. I did it with High Noon, which was combined with the Hollywood Blacklist in the early 1950s, and now with Midnight Cowboy in the late 60s. That's basically how it works. You get a little bit of both, but doing a movie like Midnight Cowboy was great fun because there's so many interesting people and so many things have to come together for that movie to ever be made. And the book's a great way to try to capture some of that.
Well, it's an exciting book. And how did you come to this subject? I mean, it's such a classic film. It's groundbreaking on so many levels. How did you come to the subject?
Well, having done The Searchers and High Noon, I was in this little subgenre, and I wanted a third one. I mean, Shane is the other great 1950s movie that everybody always talks about, but Shane didn't really speak to me. It's a great movie, but there wasn't that much more to say about the 1950s, at least not for me. So I was kicking around. It was my older daughter, actually, who asked me about something called the production code. This was the old system that Hollywood had of censorship that lasted for 30 years and more. And I didn't know a lot about it, but I knew that it had ended around 1968. You know, it's such a time of social change. I mean, politically, the country's going through kind of a collective nervous breakdown with the war in Vietnam and the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy. And meanwhile, in popular culture, things are changing dramatically, and there are more adult themes. There's more sort of frank depiction of sexuality, not just in movies, but on the stage and in books. Portnoy's Complaint and John Updike's Couples and Gore Vidal's Myra Breckenridge. So things are kind of moving. The iceberg's kind of breaking up. And when I looked it up, the production code, and then recalled the fact, because I was, a teenager then, that the rating system was adopted in 1968 by the studios to take the place of the production code. Under the production code, you couldn't even have a man and woman, a husband and wife in bed together, let alone them doing anything in bed together. They knew that the studio heads are smart people, and they knew that their box office receipts were dropping, and they knew that their old genres like, the great westerns and movie musicals and romantic comedies weren't really cutting it anymore. And so they wanted to loosen things up a bit and try to attract, younger audiences, because that was the audience that was taking over, going to the movies, and I was part of that. And you see them slowly moving into the future. 1967 was a key year because that's the year The Graduate comes out, and Bonnie and Clyde, and you see these new kinds of a little more cutting edge movies. And Midnight Cowboy is very much in that tradition. So once I, saw the juxtaposition of what's going on in Hollywood and what's going on in New York, which is, where this movie was made. And even though, and I knew a little about Midnight Cowboy, I'd seen it when it first came out in 1969. And I knew it was a pretty interesting, cutting edge, movie that was different than the other new Hollywood movies from that time and a little more groundbreaking, especially in depicting gay sexuality and straight sexuality. I just thought, okay, let's try this. And as usual, I didn't have any idea what I was getting into, that it would be not just a book about the making of a movie and about New York, but also about that there was an important gay theme there, because both the novelist who wrote Midnight Cowboy, a forgotten author, forgotten these days, named James Leo Herlihy, and the British director who came to the United States to make his first movie and decided to make Midnight Cowboy, also an exuberant gay man named John Schlesinger, and that the movie itself has not only scenes of gay sex, but also there's a lot of subcontext, I would say, that is gay oriented in the film. It put me in a whole different area than I'd been in before, and it was really exciting and at times scary to sort of be able to learn about something I knew very little about, and that's one of the important themes of the book. So I just stumbled into it, as I usually do, found it was much harder but more interesting than I expected, and just plowed ahead as best I could.
Well, there's so much to unpack about this book. I guess let's start with the director, John Schlesinger. You said he's in the book you mentioned, of course, he's British, and this to me is his most outstanding film, and I didn't realize that he had made also Falcon and Snowman and just a bunch of other great films. And so this is his first American film. Can you talk about that? Like him working in the past with his other buddies in England, and then trying on his own in the U.S.
Well, the British have a great film tradition. It had been sort of renovated, and energized in the late 50s and early 60s by a bunch of young filmmakers, and John was one of those. And they begin to make movies that are a little bit less about, upper class people, I don't know, having cocktails and, in Buckingham Palace. And they begin to go to places like the north of England, which is suffering from long-term recession and economic decline. And they make grittier, neo-realistic movies, black and white films that take after the Italian neo-realistic movement after World War II, about interesting characters. And John goes up there and makes A Kind of Loving as his first film. Then he has a breakthrough with Billy Liar, which is kind of a comedy, but also set in the north of England, and has this background of, poverty and aspiration. They're kind of going on while the Beatles are getting started in Liverpool. Working class people are beginning to emerge, and their stories are beginning to emerge for the first time. And John then comes to London and he makes Darling, this little film about swinging London, and it stars Julie Christie in her first starring role. And let me tell you, if you haven't seen Julie Christie on the screen, have a look at Darling. She knocked out a whole generation of young men, not only Britain, but America. And she wins the Oscar for Best Actress in 1966 as a result of that film. And so John suddenly is a hot director. And the folks in Hollywood want him to come out, and eventually he does. But he comes out wanting to do this little novel that he's read and that speaks to him. John wants to be like a really successful, entertaining filmmaker, but at the same time, he has his own vision of what he wants to do, and he sticks to it pretty much. And he comes to New York, and he wants to do a film about New York. And this novel Midnight Cowboy speaks to him because it's about a young guy from Texas, a very lonely, isolated figure who was abandoned by his mother and neglected by his grandmother, and and his sexuality is very, I would say, ambivalent at best. And he's coming up on a Greyhound bus from Texas, from Big Spring in the movie, in the book, actually more from Houston. And he buys a cowboy outfit, and he's going to impersonate a cowboy and become a male hustler. That's his goal. And his business model is to find, middle-aged, affluent women and service them. And it's not a very smart business model. I don't know if you've been up to 42nd Street, Adam, but I have. I went to college in New York. And there are not that many affluent, middle-class, middle-aged women walking 42nd Street looking for male hustlers. There are gay men sometimes who are doing that. And so that begins a whole set of adventures for this guy. And again, this is what John wanted to do. As you can imagine, the studios in Hollywood were not terribly interested in this kind of movie. But he managed to hook up with an independent producer in New York named Jerry Hellman, who didn't like the novel very much either, but really wanted to work with Schlesinger because of his previous success and because the movies he'd made were so good. And they go to United Artists, the sort of anti-studio studio in New York, basically based in New York, where the folks also wanted to work with John Schlesinger and were willing to give him a very tight budget, originally like $1.1 million, which didn't go all that far even in 1968. And they set him out and set Jerry out to put together this movie, and they leave him alone. They pretty much leave it to them to decide who to cast, where to get a screenwriter, who's going to be the cinematographer, all these little pieces. And with Jerry's help, John rounds up all these interesting, talented young New Yorkers to do this together. And one of the things that was so much fun for me, I mean, it's 52 years ago since the movie came out, but a lot of these folks, as I say, were young at the time. And so they're still around, a lot of them. And I got to meet them. Not only John Schlesinger died 15 or more years ago, but Jerry Hellman is still alive. The cinematographer, a guy named Adam Hollander, a Polish immigrant. It's his first, American feature film. Adam's still around. John Voight and Dustin Hoffman, who were the stars of the movie, are still around. I got to find all kinds of interesting people who remember this movie very fondly because it was a chance for all of them really to, show what they could do. And John was a very interesting guy. He knew what he wanted, but he could be very collaborative. He respected talent. He rounded up talent. He was very sort of up and down all the time. He'd come back from seeing the Rushes overnight, and he'd come in and he'd say, "We're making crap, people. I don't know. No one's ever going to go see a movie about a hustler in New York. What am I doing? What are we doing?" And they would talk him down, and they'd go and proceed with the next day or day shoot. So it's not like it was the perfect film set or anything. It was a complicated place with good things and bad things happening. But essentially these folks and the screenwriter, a guy named Waldo Salt, an older guy in his early 50s who had been blacklisted during the Red Scare in the 1950s, who was a heavy drinker and becoming a very heavy pot smoker, partly to mitigate the heavy drinking, but who had a vision of how to write this kind of screenplay, how to write a screenplay that really relied on images and, fast cuts and things to express the angst and the loneliness and isolation at the core of this character. His name was Joe Buck in the novel and the movie. And the people he meets on the streets in New York, the sort of, most of them predators of one kind or other. Anyway, they all came together to do something quite extraordinary. And if you haven't seen Midnight Cowboy, and I know a lot of folks, watching this thing probably haven't, I think it still holds up very well. Gives you a sense of what New York looked like, what New Yorkers were like in this late 60s era when the city's beginning to decline in many ways, but still is a very bubbling center for artists and would-be artists and people trying to find their future. And that's kind of, in a way, what this movie's about. And I think I think it still speaks to me, obviously, but I've seen it many a time, but I think it has something to say to all of us.
I just saw it last night, and I haven't seen it since. I take that back. I haven't clearly watched. I usually watch it scatterbrained and just have it on in the background, maybe every other year. But I watched it last night and was just breathtaking. And the ending shot is just such a phenomenal ending for the film. And I know you talked about Adam, and he's a Polish. It was his first feature film. Anyways, I just fan of his work, and that ending shot was phenomenal. Can you talk about the casting director and the kind of raw deal she kind of got? So
yeah, her name was Marion Doherty, and I'd heard of her, but I didn't know anything about her when I started this. But as the studios are beginning to, as I say, lose their audiences and lose their profits, they used to cast their own movies. They had casting directors. They had, literally hundreds of people sometimes on contract to appear as supporting actors in movies. All that's going away. And if you want to make a movie, especially in New York, you need somebody like Marion Doherty. She was working in TV mostly up to then. She knew every actor in New York. She went to all the theatrical things. As you can imagine, there were hundreds and thousands of young people flocking to New York, not just to Hollywood, but to New York, trying to be actors, going to, the actor's studio and doing lessons with all kinds of folks. And Marion kept track of them. She had this whole bank of index cards, and she'd just give everybody an index card, an individual card, and write down what they were in pencil. And when somebody wanted, an actor, she would send 2 or 3 people his way. And that was her job and her role. And Jerry Hellman knew her. The producer of Midnight Cowboy knew her and brought her in on this. And she pushed hard for both Dustin Hoffman and really hard for Jon Voight. We can talk more about these guys later, who give, extraordinary performances. They're really the heart of the movie. But she also got them all these wonderful supporting actors, like the great Sylvia Miles, who'd been in a couple of Warhol movies and a little this and that, had been on the stage. And Sylvia's only got like 6 minutes in this movie, but she's so good as a sort of aging New York hooker who Joe Buck meets early on. And he's thinking they have a little tryst, and he's thinking he's going to take $20 off her for servicing her, and instead she takes $20 off him. Anyway, 6 minutes of work. Sylvia is nominated for Best Supporting Actress for Midnight Cowboy. She's that good. This is all Marion. And toward the end, when she saw the first preview of the movie, she had lobbied hard to get what's called a single card, a credit. When they run the credits at the beginning of the movie, Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight get a single card. She wanted one as casting director because she knew she was so essential to the movie. She'd never had a single card. And when she sees the list of credits at the beginning, she doesn't have one. She's like listed third in a group of 4 people. And she's really angry. Sylvia, Marion had a temper. And she went off on Jerry Hellman and said, Jerry, we had talked about this. Where's my single card? And Jerry says, well, we just couldn't do it. Marion, I'm sorry. And it's too late to change it now. And she said, yeah, it's too late. Well, why don't you just take my name off the movie if that's how you feel about it? And Jerry, who had a temper of his own, these are 2 strong people, said, okay, and took her name off it. He told me, Jerry, Marion died about 8 years ago, so I never had the chance to see her. But Jerry told me he deeply regretted having taken her name off, and he was thinking she would come back in a day or 2, when everybody's temper had settled down and they would have worked something out. But she didn't come back. Her name's not on it. It's an example, I think, of how women were treated in movies in those days, without the respect that she deserved. With John Schlesinger, the director, always credited Marion with getting that cast together. When people would say to him, where did you find Jon Voight? What a great, because Jon Voight is fabulous as Joe Buck. John would say, well, the crazy thing is I didn't even want him for the movie, but Marion Doherty insisted. He always gave her credit for it, which she deserved. She doesn't get a single credit, her own card till 3 or 4 years later. I think in the Great Waldo Pepper movie is her first one. But man, she earned it. And being able to write about somebody like that and how her work, why she was so important and what was changing in Hollywood and New York that made her such an important figure was a great part of the book for me, and something I'd never anticipated when I got started with it.
That's what I love about your book. It's so detailed. I mean, you just zero in on super minute details that are great for super fans like me. And like, I guess one of the most obvious things to talk about is the Dustin Hoffman walking scenario or scene. Can you explain that and unpack the myth?
Well, yeah, there are a couple of myths about Midnight Cowboy. One about its X rating, but another one about the "I'm walking here" moment. Hoffman plays Ratso Rizzo, this little scuzzy, I think that's the right word, disabled, outcast, street person, con man from the Bronx. So, you have John Voight, Joe Buck, 6'3", blonde, naive country mouse, and you have Hoffman, Ratso Rizzo, who takes $20 off Joe early on, cons him out of $20. They meet, and part of that con is when they first meet in a bar, Ratso takes him around and they're walking, and Ratso's explaining how he can hook him up with a pimp who's going to, get him hundreds of women customers, and big money. They're crossing a crosswalk when a taxi cab sort of veers into the crosswalk, and Ratso slams his hand down and says, "Hey, I'm walking here, and cusses the guy out. And it's a famous moment. It's very New York, and it's probably the most famous little moment in the film. And Hoffman always said that he had improv the whole thing, that this was not, the cab wasn't in the script or anything, but it was just a cab driver, busting through trying to beat the light. Well, when you go back and look at Waldo Salt's draft script from December '67, there it is. The scene's there. The cab is in the crosswalk. The only difference is that in the script, there's no dialogue. So Ratso flicks off the cab driver and they walk away, and they continue, he and Joe continue their conversation. Dustin did invent the dialogue, that I'm walking here. And he says, originally he was going to go, hey, we're making a movie here, but he caught himself and he stayed in character. And, he did this for me when I finally met Dustin, and he was very generous with his time in the end. And we spent a couple of hours at his office in LA. He did the scene for me, he stood up and slammed the conference table and did the whole thing. He's done it for, dozens and dozens of people, I think, over the years. He's very proud of it. So the story's kind of half true, like a lot of Hollywood stories. It wasn't totally improv, but he has to, he gets credit for the line itself, no question.
It's a beautiful scene. I mean, it's just breathtaking. It's like the Terminator line, "I'll be back." It's phenomenal, right? So, and then can you talk about, you said earlier that he had first made the Graduate movie and can you talk about like where he, that whole process of how he got into the film, Midnight Cowboy?
Yeah, he and Voight are both longtime sort of young guys trying to make it in New York in the theater scene. And they go to acting school and they work with other people and they do off Broadway. And gradually they're beginning to get a little traction, but neither of them ever thought they'd be movie stars. Hoffman had a certain disdain for Hollywood and, the way things work there. But to his great shock, I think, the director, Mike Nichols, decided to cast him in The Graduate. And The Graduate is a great turning point movie also in the history of New Hollywood and in baby boomers becoming the main audience for Hollywood, because it's a huge hit in 1967. He's a huge hit. He doesn't look like your average movie star. He's not Robert Redford, who wanted the role, or Cary Grant or any of those. He's sort of he's short, he's Jewish, he's got a large nose and he's a little swarthy, and he's just different. And yet he becomes not only a big time movie star, he also becomes something of a counterculture icon, because here's a guy breaking the rules. He's obviously knows his craft. He studied. He's really good at it. He's a little, after the Graduate, he's both happy to be a movie star in some ways, but also restless about it, because he's a character actor. I mean, he knows, he doesn't want to be typecast as just this guy who was in Mike Nichols's movie and being told what to do. He wants to show that he can do any kind of role, that Benjamin Braddock, is not who he is. And so he wants to do Ratso Rizzo. He had known about it before he went off to do The Graduate. John Schlesinger, the director, doesn't want him. He doesn't want some new minted movie star to come in and mess up his little movie. And Hoffman's angry, that he can't seem to get to Schlesinger. But he finally, because he is a big star, he gets Schlesinger to meet with him, and Hoffman puts on a dirty raincoat, and he doesn't shave for a couple of days, and he's limping around like Ratso Rizzo does, and he meets him at the Automat on 42nd Street at midnight, and with an accent and with, a limp and all of that. And by 5 a.m., Schlesinger says, he talked me into it. He wore me down. He looked like he belonged on 42nd Street, because Hoffman's a great actor. And so that's how they got, and Marion Doherty had definitely pushed him. She'd seen him on off-Broadway. She knew he could do this. Jerry Hellman knew it, the producer. Voight was harder even to get, though, because, he wasn't hard to get. He really wanted to do the part. He hadn't been in any movie, and he really felt he was perfect for Joe Buck. Voight is a very sincere, committed, obsessed guy, and he thought he'd be perfect in the role. But Schlesinger had in mind someone with a different look. In the novel, Joe Buck is a tall, dark-haired guy. Well, John Voight's a sort of Dutch boy, especially that then dimpled Dutch boy kind of guy. Schlesinger wanted a guy named Michael Sarrazin, and they auditioned various people, and Schlesinger chose Sarrazin. Marion Doherty was angry about that, because she knew that she felt Voight was the right person, that Voight had this little kernel of vulnerability and even potential for violence, that Joe Buck, he could play that with Joe Buck. And he also understood the comedy of being Joe Buck in New York and all that. They chose Sarrazin. They even started outfitting Sarrazin, for costumes, but it turned out Sarrazin was signed to Universal, and when they went to, sign a contract for very little money for this movie, Universal balked and said, no, let's negotiate now. And with a tight budget, this just stopped Jerry Hellman and John Schlesinger in their tracks. They said every time they looked at the audition tapes after that, Michael Sarrazin looked a little worse and John Voight looked a little better. So eventually they talked themselves into John Voight, and Schlesinger said afterwards, I'm so glad I did. Those two guys, Hoffman and Voight, Adam, I don't know, who you would compare them to, but I don't think there's a pair of male movie, lead performers in a movie who are any better than them or even as good. I think the collaboration between them, the way they play this, and especially Voight, the way he just epitomizes Joe Buck. They improv together for weeks. Waldo Salt, wrote some of the improvs into the script. The intimacy they brought to their characters, the way they developed their characters from the inside out, I think is one of the things that makes the movie so special.
And what was another huge part of this movie is can you talk about how Bob Dylan is connected to this? Which I love this story. This is such a great. It's so cool.
Well, we haven't talked about the music, and the music is such an important part of the movie. And when you see the movie, you'll see two really wonderful songs. You'll see Harry Nilsson singing "Everybody's Talking," which became after the movie a huge hit, or at the time of the movie, because and it helped create the audience for the movie, and it captures beautifully the sort of enigmatic, vulnerable longing inside this poor schnook Joe Buck. who's trying to find his way in the world, and he's a lonely figure. The song was written by a guy named Fred Neil, who was a Greenwich Village folk singer who people like me know about from that generation, but I'm afraid whose name is long lost. John found this song early on because his partner, his young boyfriend, a guy named Michael Childers, discovered Aerial Ballet, Harry's album, and brought this. But meanwhile, they'd been talking to other people about doing the music. They'd worked on the script out in Malibu in a beach house, with Waldo Salt and Jerry Hellman, and living up the road there is Bob Dylan. And Dylan hears about this, and they talk to Dylan, and Dylan says he'd love to do a song for the movie. The only problem being that Dylan doesn't come back to them till kind of too late. He brings them Lay Lady Lay, a song that he wrote, as far as I understand, for the movie. And he shows up at Jerry's apartment in New York, Jerry Hellman's apartment, with a acoustic guitar on his back, in its case, some kind of leather case, and carries it in, takes it out, plays Lay Lady Lay. Jerry looks at him and says, "I'm really sorry, Bob, but John Schlesinger really wants Everybody's Talking, and that's what we're going to do." Bob puts the guitar away, puts it right on his back. I think they talked for about 3 minutes. Jerry asked him a question or two about the business. Bob answered, as best he could. Walked out the door. Jerry never saw him again, ever. At the same time, Joni Mitchell wrote a song called Midnight Cowboy, a sort of ballad. Leonard Cohen offered them Bird on a Wire. They talked to Donovan about doing the whole movie at one point, but John kept coming back to Everybody's Talking. He liked the rhythm of it, for one thing. It's a bouncy, catchy song, and he was doing a temp track edit of the movie using that rhythm, as directors often do. Nielsen himself really didn't want that to be the song because, Harry didn't write Everybody's Talking. And United Artists didn't want it because they didn't have control over Everybody's Talking. Fred Neil had written it and had recorded it earlier himself. So Harry tried to write his own song for them. And he wrote a song called I Guess the Lord Must Be in New York City, which is the exact same rhythm. Everybody's Talking. And very, very similar, except it's much more literal. It captures somebody coming to New York specifically. And John preferred Everybody's Talking. The enigmatic, poignant quality of it and I think it was a great choice because that song is one of the things that ties the movie together. It doesn't narrate the movie. It's not like in High Noon where Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darling tells the story of the movie. Doesn't at all, but it tells you the inner life of this very sad, lonely guy. And man, I think it's really an essential part. As I say, when you talk about so many things coming together, the music, the costumes done by the fabulous Anne Roth, who I interviewed a couple of years ago, who's now 89 years old and just got nominated for the 5th time for an Oscar for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. She's a pistol. She is just such a enthusiastic, crazy, creative soul. And she sewed these costumes. She was on the set. She sewed every costume for every extra, for every person in that movie, but most particularly Joe Buck's kind of faux cowboy outfit and Ratso Risso's collection of scuzzy, dirty clothes. They all come from this incredibly talented woman. So between the music and the costumes and the editing, everything clicks.
Well, it's funny you say editing. Can you talk about the? I could totally see this in an independent film. This kind of like how it's supposed to go and how it actually goes. Can you talk about the editing?
Absolutely. They were, Jerry and John were looking for an editor, and the great Arthur Penn, the director of Bonnie and Clyde and The Miracle Worker, Arthur Penn had worked with a young guy named Hugh Robertson, who wanted to be a director. Hugh was African American. He couldn't get, it was hard for him to break in, even as an editor. It took many years. He was the first African American to be in the editors union. But the Penn recommended him. They liked the idea of getting someone of working with a new person because they were new too in so many ways. Hugh passed away many years ago, so I wasn't able to talk to him, but I was able to find one or two people who had worked in him, and a woman named Irene Bowers who worked with him on Midnight Cowboy. And she loved Hugh. She thought he was really good at his job, but he wasn't good at the part of it that involved sort of working diplomatically with the director. And John was, as I suggested earlier, a very nervous guy. He'd be up and down every day, and Hugh was not prepared to be John's psychologist. Plus, Hugh was a New Yorker, and he looked at what was going on in the movie, and he didn't care for its depiction of New York. He thought it was like a tourist view or a very superficial view. He wasn't happy with it, and John wasn't happy with him, and they fought all the time. Hugh, interestingly, his office was in the Brill Building, this sort of, creative center around 7th Avenue and 47th Street, very close to Times Square, on the outskirts of Times Square. Anyway, John eventually managed to bring into the country his editor from the UK, a guy named Jim Clark. He especially was disheartened because the opening scenes of the movie, the getting on the Greyhound bus, the going to New York, which includes a lot of sort of flash cuts sewn into the scene that take you back into Joe Buck's early life and try to explain a little bit about where he comes from and why he's so, messed up, both his dreams and his sexuality. John wasn't seeing that cohere. And Jim Clark did put a lot of that together. But Jim Clark's passed away several years ago also, but in his memoir about, which included his work on Midnight Cowboy, he said actually that Hugh and his gang had done a decent job of editing most of the movie, and that he did most of his help work in that first section, bringing it back together, going right back to the original rushes to rebuild the opening scene. So yes, it was a complicated thing. John, Jim Clark talks about walking John home at night and John being incandescent and so worried and saying, how's anybody ever going to want to see this piece of crap? And Jim trying to talk him into believing that this movie was going to be a great movie, and John never really quite believing it and never really believing in Hugh Robertson. So Hugh got nominated for Best Film Editor for this movie, which was a great feather in his cap. And he eventually did direct a movie or two, and he was involved with Shaft and some other great movies of that era. Died much too young. And as I say, but it was just another part of this tale. I don't just tell these stories because they're cool movie stories. I think they all fit into understanding the times that the movie was made in, and the independent work that people did and how. So, for example, as I say, with Marion Doherty's story, it's a story about a woman who wouldn't have even had the opportunity she had in an earlier era, but who still was treated as a second-class citizen. I'm always trying to do something that reflects the era of the movie that was made in, because these stories all do in a powerful way, and Hugh's story does.
Well, kind of to round the bases, I think this film, it's obviously launched super actors into celebrityism, but can you talk about Waldo Salt and his experience in the film and then afterwards?
Yes, of course. That's the other really important figure in this. Waldo had come to Hollywood actually in the 1930s, and he's an early champion of the idea that screenwriting is not really about words, it's about images, and that the words have to serve the images. And he considered it a different form of writing than regular prose, than anything that had come before it, than stage writing. The studios in the 30s were inviting novelists to come, William Faulkner and F. Scott Fitzgerald and, George Bernard Shaw, the playwright. The studios were bringing it, once that silence had gone away and we were in the talking era where actors were, expected to talk to do dialogue. The studios thought, well, we need words. Waldo thought, we don't need words so much as we need images, and we need to make sense of the images. He does pretty well for a long time, but he's also a member of the American Communist Party. And when the blacklist rolls around and the Red Scare in the late 40s and early 50s, he loses his job. He can't get paid to write. He uses a pseudonym and he writes, TV shows for British TV under a pseudonym and some American things for very little money. He moves his family to New York. He's a mess. But after the blacklist ends in the 60s, he can't really hook on with much. But eventually, John Schlesinger and Jerry Hellman find him because they're having trouble getting the kind of screenplay they want for this crazy little movie they're making. And Waldo, who's lived in New York and has a feel for what the city's like, has some things they like. So eventually they hook up with him. And he writes them, and he shows he's interested in the core of the movie, in the relationship between Joe Buck and Ratso Rizzo, this wary, angry little thing where these guys come to rely on each other because they've got nobody else, and winter's setting in, and they got no money, and so they have to depend on each other. Waldo captures that beautifully. He never makes it into a buddy movie where they, warm feelings between them, but he captures their need. So Waldo, is an important part of the group that does this movie. He also brings to their attention his beautiful daughter, Jennifer Saul, who's trying to make it as an actress. They need somebody to play the role of Joe Buck's Texas girlfriend. It's a very small part, but Jennifer gets that part. She and John Voight, the Joe Buck character, hit it off. She becomes Voight's girlfriend. She was wonderful to interview because she knew all these people. She'd been involved in it herself, and she could tell me about them and her dad, of course. So for Waldo, Midnight Cowboy is a redemptive moment. He gets to work with incredibly talented people. He's on the set every day. When a scene doesn't work, they call him in. He works with the actors. He works with Schlesinger. He's happy to rewrite. He's happy to take improv and build it into the script. He says it was the greatest experience he'd ever had working with these guys, especially with Hoffman and Voight, because they were so talented. And after this, he goes on. He wins the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for Midnight Cowboy. And then Waldo, after, he's resurrected. He does a number of good movies. He co-writes Serpico, the Al Pacino movie. Midnight Cowboy set off a range of gritty, interesting New York movies that include Serpico, that include Dog Day Afternoon, Mean Streets, the first Godfather movie, and The Great French Connection. Waldo gets to do that. He eventually co-writes the screenplay for Coming Home, the Vietnam veteran movie in the late 70s, where John Voight is the lead actor along with Jane Fonda, and where Waldo is co-writer of the screenplay. Again, another, I would say, towering figure in his own way who gets resurrected by Midnight Cowboy.
Well, I think you just you do a fabulous job in this book. Like I said, I'm a film history super fan, and you just kind of like zero in on super minute details that I absolutely enjoy, and I thoroughly recommend this book. And then let's see, how many Oscars was this? Can you talk about the Oscar scenarios?
Sure. It was nominated for 7. It won 3, but it won 3 crucial ones. Best Picture, the only X-rated film ever to win Best Picture. Best Director for Schlesinger, and Best Adapted Screenplay for Waldo. Both Voight and Hoffman were nominated for Best Actor. The actor who won that year was the great John Wayne for True Grit. And I think Hoffman and Voight both realized they weren't going to win that one, that he was getting really the Oscar for Wayne for a lifetime's career. But nonetheless, it's kind of interesting. Wayne is name-checked in the movie at the point where Ratso says to Joe Buck, this cowboy stuff, this cowboy outfit, it's never going to make it. No woman is going to, be attracted to that. And it's gay, and Waldo uses a derogatory term for gay people. They're the only ones. And Joe Buck says, what do you mean? Look at John Wayne. He's a he's a cowboy. You're going to tell me John Wayne is gay? So Wayne gets name checked in the movie, and he beat them for the Oscars. But it was one of those moments where a movie no one expected to do that well, not only does really well at the box office, but also becomes an iconic movie and is recognized by Hollywood as the best movie of the year.
It's a classic around the world. So, but I thank you for letting me be a part of this. Thank you, Glenn. and the San Antonio Book Festival.
No, thank you. And thanks to everybody at the San Antonio Book Festival. It's great to be back at it. I only wish I were there maybe next year.
For sure. We'll go to meet you afterwards.
Okay. It's a deal.